Hello, I'm Tony Robinson from the University of Colorado, Denver, and I'm going to give a two-part talk on the unexpected rise of Korea as a global economic and cultural powerhouse. And certainly that is exactly what's happening. Korea, as a nation, is dominating right now the much of the world economy, and certainly in terms of cultural production. What we find, I guess dominating would be too strong a word, but in terms of its rapid rise, Korea is a bit blindsided in the world. This is a nation that has went from extreme poverty 50 years ago to immense economic wealth and economic productive power faster than any nation has in history. And today, as these pictures to the right of your slide shows, they have an incredible cultural force throughout Asia and across the world. Their dance, music, movies, drama, Korean cultural power right now is the dominant force in Asia in terms of commercializing and making money on that cultural power. And economically, the nation is incredibly powerful as well. In fact, if you look at as this chart shows, the rapid rise of Korea starting around the 1980s is unparalleled among nations in the world right now. It is that Korea has caught up to most industrial nations. It is maybe a slightly larger economy even than Germany. And this is for a very small nation that is 60th in the world in population. This is a nation that does not have petroleum reserves, gold, many resources. They aren't resource rich in terms of natural resources, and they're small, and they had been isolated 50 years ago. And yet, rising from that position of a small, kind of low population nation, Korea has become first in semiconductors today, the first in the world, first in LCD panels. They're the largest shipbuilder in the world. They produce more flat screen TVs than any country in the world. They produce the largest ships as well to ship those TVs to the rest of the world. They produce the second most smartphones. They have the world's fifth largest reserves of steel and oil. They're the sixth largest gold reserves. They produce cars. They refine petroleum. They're the second largest exporter in the world and the 15th largest GDP and growing. And this has happened so quickly that it was not predicted that Korea would rise to this prominence so quickly, especially considering the dire situation Korea was in 1960. If you just go back 40, 50 years, Korea, in fact, is the poorest nation perhaps in the entire world. They're the poorest of all UN nations. After 40 years of civil war, the Korean War, and colonialization by Japan before that, Korea only had about a $79 annual GDP. This is compared to the Philippines at $170, Thailand at $260. Korea is the poorest nation in the United Nations in 1960. And as I said, without substantial national resources. This leads to situations like the history of one of their famous national dishes, budae jjigae, which simply means army stew. Koreans were impoverished, and so they would often come to the U.S. Army bases and look for food and ask for food and assistance. And the U.S. soldiers would give them Spam and hot dogs and American cheese, and they'd mix it together with ramen and make this dish, which to those who haven't had it may not sound the most attractive or delicious, but it is a crazy delicious stew or dish. And anybody that's been to Korea and had it can attest to this unusual dish of Spam and American cheese or Velveeta, and top ramen is crazy good, and they've turned it into kind of national meal. But it dates back to years of poverty when Koreans were looking for any kind of protein or meat that they could find. But following this period of time, in the 1950s and 60s, is this immense period of rapid economic growth that really began in 1961 to 1979, which we now know was the fastest modernization or industrialization or urbanization project in world history. Between 1955 and 1970, 500,000 people a year moved to Seoul. I mean, that's just unheard of in the world. The area explodes from just around 500,000 people to 26 million people in the greater Seoul area by 2000. Half of the nation coming to live in that city, that immense, productive, industrial force that Seoul became in those years. Now, this was, as these pictures show, a dramatic transformation of the urban landscape. In just 30, 40 years, you went from the picture on the top of this slide to the scene on the bottom. you went, and all of these slides kind of show this modernization and how rapid it was in Korea. From after the Korean War, when people were reduced to like picking through the rubble to find metal and things to build with or heating materials, to 50 years after that, one of the world's largest, most technologically advanced, most internet wired, most powerful economic forces in the world as a city, and producing some of the, as I said, Asia's most dominant cultural forms, which actually my next talk will detail in a little more detail. In this picture, you see the transformation of the area south of the river, Gangnam area, and you see in this area, this second picture, the one, the aerial shot, is taken from the top of a skyscraper, Lotte Tower, that is one of the tallest skyscrapers in all of Asia now. It was just opened a couple of years ago. It kind of announces Korea's dominant presence on the world to produce these tall super skyscrapers. And the fact that it's produced by Lotte tells you something about how this industrialization project, how this modernization project happened. Lotte is one of the Korea's large, what they call CHYEBOLs, or what they are is like corporations that spread across the economy, that do multiple forms of business, such as candy, plus producing automobiles, plus producing apartment buildings, plus producing schools. That would be a CHYEBOL that produces a lot of things together. This really begins, these rise of these great CHYEBOLs, as a strategic strategy of the state, what we call now state-led industrial development, or you could call it developmentalism. And it's important to understand this as a political and economic strategy or philosophy for growth. Nations can pursue different strategies, lesser developed nations. One could be a kind of free market approach, which is kind of open your borders to trade, invite foreign countries into your country to do business, find your own niche, maybe as a lower wage workforce, or maybe you're producing a certain product like oil in Nigeria, and that kind of free market competition in our country will rise over the long run. That's a kind of free market model that we often hear as the way to the future. But some of these Asian nations, and particularly Korea, for this case, chose a different strategy. And they call it developmentalism, which is not a free market strategy, but is where the state, in this case, in the case of Korea, it was led by a leader called Park Chung-hee, who led the nation from the 1960s into the 1970s, 61 to 79. For 18 years he was president. When he became president, he said, we aren't going to go free market. Instead, the state is going to choose specific strategic industries that we can compete in. Textiles, concrete. He chose steel, actually, cars, apartment building. We're going to choose these. We're going to choose some corporations that can succeed in there, and they're going to be state-favored corporations. They're going to get all state contracts. We're going to protect them from foreign competition. We're going to subsidize them with state grants, and we're going to build these companies up. We're going to move workers into the companies, literally with economic development plans, where we take people from the rural countryside, as you see in the middle, these workers. We're going to take them from the countryside, kind of force them to move to Seoul under a state-led development plan, put them in these modern apartments that we're going to build with Korean companies, and they're going to work hard in these companies, building them up as competitors. And when this company is strong and experienced and has built itself up with this state support and Korean labor force, then we will kind of engage the world and open those companies to more global competition once we've made them strong. They call that a kind of developmentalist strategy. And Park Chung-hee led the way, bringing in millions of workers, 500,000 a year from the countryside into Seoul, with a deal that you will move into one of these modern apartments that we're building with Korean money, etc. We will build you into these apartments, and you will move there. You will also agree to be a warrior worker, a pillar of export, where you will work hard in your company. You will get low wages. There will not be strong democratic rights. But in the long run, you will build up the future of your country. And this became the kind of compact of Korea. And these CHYEBOLs that kind of led the way were these kind of vertically integrated and very disciplined CHYEBOLs that when workers worked in them, they weren't, there wasn't a lot of worker rights, and there wasn't a lot of democratic rights in the country. And the CHYEBOLs that kind of led the way, when we say vertically integrated, we're talking large super companies that the state protected. And when they say super companies, companies like Samsung, for example, they aren't just a company that produces phones. These companies typically will, like, let's take Samsung. They produce hospitals. Samsung owns hospitals. They own schools. They run bakeries known as Paris Baguette throughout Korea. They build apartments. They produce cars. They produce electronics and phones and TV panels. They have hospitals and cemeteries. So you can be born in a Samsung hospital, go to school in a Samsung school, shop and buy Samsung bakery products throughout your life to eat, and then die, drive a Samsung car, use Samsung products, and die and be buried in a Samsung graveyard. So cradle to grave, these companies can wrap their arms around you. Lotte is a candy confectionery, but also runs apartments and apartment buildings and department stores and amusement parks. So these are huge, widespread companies that the state has chosen to support and subsidize and build into effective national conveyors of national economic prowess. And then they kind of open themselves up to global competition once they've become strong. A good example of how this can happen is in the old story of the Seoul-Busan freeway and how Hyundai became a large conglomerate. Back 50 years ago, Seoul had no freeways. There was no big multi-lane freeway. And they decided, Korea had no freeways, not Seoul. Park Chung-hee decided they needed to start building these national arteries. Well, they had no companies that had produced big freeways like this. But Park Chung-hee said, I'm not going to hire a foreign company. We're not going to bring in some foreign, engineering firm. We're going to take one of our smaller companies, Hyundai, and I'm going to get that leader on board and tell him, if you can build me this freeway in 3 years, you are going to be the darling of the state. We're going to give you future contracts, all future, like, freeway building contracts. We're going to build up your company this way. And the leader of Hyundai said, all right, we can do it. Although they never done anything like this before. And the state gave them all the contracts for concrete and engineering and building the whole freeway. The state helped them get low-wage workers by the millions to produce this freeway and made sure that there would not be any strikes or any kind of worker unrest to get this thing built. The idea was to build this entire thing, 428 kilometers, in less than 3 years. 9 million workers, day and night, working according to the Korean philosophy of pali pali, which is fast, hurry, make it happen quick. And in 2.5 years, Hyundai built that freeway as a super modern, well-designed freeway between Seoul and Busan. Cost 1/10 the cost of similar freeways in Japan. Probably 1/10 the time is what it might take to build such a freeway in America. And it was built. And as the possibly apocryphal story goes, when Park Chung-hee and the president of Hyundai were standing on that freeway after it had been finished, and they looked at it going into the distance with no cars on it, because Korea was not a developed country with a lot of cars. Park Chung-hee turns to Hyundai and says, so, what do you know about making cars? And Hyundai went into the car-making business to fill its freeways, also protected by the state. And this is how Hyundai became a state-designed, state-supported, powerful company. Of course, it's important to know that another piece of this is not just the brilliance of Hyundai and their engineering prowess, but is the dedication of the Korean people underneath that. So a second factor to Korea's growth, besides this, the first factor is state-led developmentalism and large chaebols. The second factor is this warrior worker character of the people. Park Chung-hee called workers in Korea pillars of export. The dedicated workers who are going to be disciplined and work extra hours at the workforce and committed to rising the nation on their backs. Today, sometimes you hear concept of the Samsung man, someone who works extra hours for low pay, doesn't get paid maybe for their extra hours, but is going to work extra to build up the character of the Korean people. Certainly in Korea, this is the case. Korea is perhaps one of the most Confucian of all Asian nations. And what I mean by Confucian is this deeply embedded concept of fulfilling your duty and working hard in your station in life. And Korea has long had that concept. Today, among all developed nations, there is no developed nation whose people work longer and harder with less time off than the Korean people. This chart to the right of your slide shows that. Among all developed nations, South Korea is right up at the top. And you have to go down quite a bit on this chart to get to, say, Israel or the United States as similar nations. So the Korean people have this long enduring concept of working hard, dedicating to the workforce, do your job, do good discipline, and you find this just in the amount of hours they work. Of course, that leads to possibly some negative consequences. In this poetry by Kim Joo-tae, he's writing about the consequences of this kind of hard work at chemical factories. And he writes, "They call it a factory, but it's just a big shed. A stench of molten polyethylene, intense heat. Taehyung Chemicals sounds impressive for a place where they turn people into plastic. A place like a sauna, but without even a fan, breathing in stinking chemicals, producing pure plastic like silkworms in Taehyung Chemicals factory. People from Muon and Chola, from Tonyang and Chungcheon, who shoulder their dreams and come up to Seoul, all melt and turn into plastic. Their dreams and loves melt and turn into plastic." He's writing about the consequences of an industrial model of just rapid growth, of building these big factories and freeways, and how this is incredibly hard on workers who lift this city to heaven above their heads, and maybe dreaming of a softer Korea to come. But at the time of this poetry, of course, was not the case. It was very hard for Korean workers, and not just hard for the workers, but for their students, for their children. A second factor beyond just the hard work and the intense energy of the Korean people is their dedication to education. And what we find also in the Korean culture is they're probably the most educated people on earth, with like a 99% literacy rate, longer hours studying than other youth in developed countries. Koreans are famous for it. And if you look at any evidence or charts, you'll see the Koreans far outpace Americans or British or Germans or even Japanese for the amount of time they spend on education. On the right, you see children preparing for an exam, pretty high stress moment. The sad counterpart of this is their very, very high suicide rates of young students around the times of exams. So what accounts for the rise of the Korean economy, this unpredicted rise, is this state developmentalism, supporting these large chaebols who've kind of taken the reins of the Korean economy and become powerful and able to compete in the global economy, added to the fact of Korean kind of warrior worker culture and willingness, and kind of actually with state encouragement and force to work longer hours than any people in the world, and an immense dedication to education where their children are the most educated in the world. These things partly explain the rise of the Korean economy. They explain what we now call the Korean wave. And you can see this wave embedded in the new architecture that is emerging out of Korea. In this slide, we see in the forefront, we see the old Japanese city hall, where the Japanese had built this colonial city hall when they took over Korea, and they put it right where the palaces used to be. And you can see it looks authoritarian and mighty. It's the building in front in this slide, and a little dark. Well, that city hall was just closed a few years ago, and Korea opened up a new Seoul City Hall right behind it. And you can see it as a kind of towering glass wave coming down over the top of the Japanese city hall, old Japanese city hall. And that notion of a Korean wave both expresses the rise of Korean power, kind of overtaking Japan, and even as a kind of tsunami coming down on the Japanese city hall. But it also is glass and curvy and futuristic and softer than the old Japanese city hall. And that speaks to the newly emerging kind of Korean power, which is not so much built on industry and freeways and mass production of apartments and concrete, but is going to move towards cultural power and soft power and this new wave of Korean power that is emerging today. And in the next presentation that I'll have, part 2, I'll talk about that new wave of Korean cultural power.